At Oh My Bod, innovation meets self-care, helping adults of all ages reclaim confidence, curiosity, and connection. Explore their collection at ohmybod.com. That's ohmibod.com. Hi, this is Suzanne, and you're listening to Sex Advice for Seniors. And today I'm really delighted to welcome Malia Lazu, who's the founder of Sunflower Spa. She's in Hawaii, lucky bitch, a woman-centered space dedicated to healing, sensuality, and belonging. And she's created this really inclusive environment so that women can explore pleasure, identity, and self-worth without judgment. And that really resonated for me because, as I know, as a woman in later life, so many of us are told to shut up, especially about sex and pleasure. Lots of people don't want to hear about older people's sex lives. I know everybody listening to this does, but generally, I think, it's still very, very taboo. And so I'm really curious to talk to Malia about shame and confidence and what it really means to reclaim sexuality at any age. So welcome to Sex Advice for Seniors. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you so much. And just thank you for holding this space. As you said, we don't talk about it. I mean, at younger ages, we talk about it in a maladapted way. And I feel like, I'm getting to the age and, you're reaffirming what I'm saying, that we should be freer the older we get. And so thanks so much for reminding us of that with your podcast.
Thanks. So you set up this Sunflower Spa. You've got quite a varied background, though. So I'm curious what this is about for you and why you did this.
I like to say I'm an organizer. Like wherever I am trying to take the people who are closest to the problem and get them closest to the solution. And so, I've meandered with purpose in my life, I think, and been able to be in a lot of interesting spaces. And in the past couple of years, I was running a successful business and working with Fortune 500 companies, it all seemed to be like check, 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 bad bitch status. And then Trump got elected, and the idea of equity and culture, the idea of liking women, the idea of liking people of color, liking people with disabilities, it all became too hard. And I found myself in the beginning of 2025, there was two parts of me, right? Like the first part was like, pivot your business, figure this out, get your clients to stay. And then there was another part of me that was just like, no, I don't want to. And I realized in the year that I gave myself to figure out what I want to do, that there's so many women in this position that have spent their entire lives building beautiful lives. I mean, I love my life. But when it comes to the core of me standing in my power, me accessing my magic, it was much more of a chore than it should be, And then I heard this stat, and this stat broke my heart. And this is when I decided I was going to be unapologetic about sex and pleasure, which was 69% of women are sexually unsatisfied, including 62% of lesbians. And it was the lesbian stat that really made me sad, because I assumed, if you know the roads, you can drive them quicker. But what it showed to me is it wasn't about the partner, right? Like it was actually about, can you lay down and receive someone wanting to please you, And I think for women, there's so many reasons why that becomes hard, whether it is shame, whether it is worth, whether it is, do you actually feel safe in this space? And I mean, there's, many women who are sitting with partners for years that they don't feel safe with, right? Like, so all of those things started coming up. And, I have this amazing ecosystem of healers that I've been working with over the last 15 years. And it just made sense to find practitioners who wanted to help women heal, who were feminist, anti-patriarchal, and to give women a place to give themselves permission.
Look, there's a lot of stats about women and sexual pleasure and lack of satisfaction. I'm curious to know, with that particular stat, what unsatisfied means Did it just mean not having an orgasm, or what is it? Because there's various ways of being unsatisfied.
Right. It was a range. This was really centered around women's ability to orgasm. But I think you're right in this sense of like, why, right? Because there's a lot of different types of reasons why you would be dissatisfied. This quote I read in I think it was called The Pleasure Gap. And it was about what does it mean that women spend so much time in the bedroom faking it? And I think faking orgasms is one unfortunate thing, but there also might be other areas that we fake it that allow them to be willing to fake something as intimate and sacred and magical as an orgasm rather than being like, hey, you know what I actually need you to do? Like it becomes easier to just be like, oh yeah, that was great. Okay, let me, right? Like these areas where we become okay with being unsatisfied, I think is ultimately the conversation that Sunflower wants to have. We talk about it as purpose, power, pleasure. And, we had this brunch on pleasure. All these women, it was so great. It was like intergenerational. Like our oldest was 72, like our youngest was 35. And this woman stood up and she was a single mom. And she said, it's really hard for her to date and, hard for her to find time to actually bring someone home. And so she finally is having this, right? She's able to like bring someone home and they're having sex. And all of a sudden she starts to put together like her grocery list, like what she has to do after she picks up her son, and she just, she asked the pleasure doula that we brought, like, how do I stop that? Right. And you could see every woman being like, oh, I'm taking notes for this. Like, I need this answer, and the answer was physical. Like the answer was get nipple clamps, like get something so that you can just bring yourself back into your body. These are the lessons we're not taught.
The biggest challenge that I think we've always had is being able to understand what sexual pleasure looks like for us and how we can communicate that to somebody else in a way that doesn't make them feel inadequate, right? Like, I need you to do this for me, and being able to be confident enough to be able to ask for what you want. I mean, you talked about that for you, one of the big reasons of doing this is to preserve people's anonymity. Why do you think women don't feel safe enough to talk honestly about sex and pleasure?
So I think there's two things, right? How sex is weaponized against women, right? And this idea that like men can be hoes, but women can't, from a very young age, right? This idea of virginity, this sacred gift that you should give to someone, that's actually structural oppression, right? Like, and so there's that piece of it. But then I think as we get into our own social groups, we sort of reaffirm that behavior, and it becomes a taboo subject, right? It's almost like medical stuff, like it's something that you don't want to share. There might be shame in what you're sharing. And so, to have a place where you can find practitioners, you can find other women and just feel what safety feels like. Because I think that's another thing, like we often think about it like, well, safety means I'm not about to die or whatever, right? But it's like, no, like safety actually is psychological, it's emotional, and it doesn't mean you have to be with someone for a long time to feel that safety, right? Like, I mean, I think you can have very intense one night stands, right? But you just need to know that there's a respect that you're being treated with dignity and a level of humanity that can make this fun.
Most sex toy sites overwhelm you. GITM Playbook simplifies everything. They use external to internal logic, start outside the body, then only go further if you want to. And they only stock body-safe materials, no compromises. And the site is organized into bold, clear categories that make shopping fast and easy. It's the beginner's guide that actually works. Go to gitmplaybook.com. I find amongst other women that sometimes there's a tendency to do a bit of what I call orgasm one-upmanship.
I love that. Tell me more. Orgasm went upmanship.
When I talked about the fact that I'm not a great believer that there's like a zillion kinds of orgasms, and I'm just quite focused on my clitoral orgasm, and
They're a lot of fun.
because it's very clear when I'm having one. And then people are like, no, I've spoken to tantra practitioners. It's like, what, you've never experienced a cervical orgasm? And I'm like, no, I don't think I've ever experienced that. And what about this one and the G spot and that one and the other one? And I'm like, it's not a competition here, girls, to see who has had the most different types of orgasms here. And I think oftentimes it's when somebody does put themselves out in that vulnerable way that you spoke about, where you said this woman admitted, like, look, sometimes it's really difficult for me to be present. Sometimes I'm just too stressed out. And the only thing I'm thinking about is the fact I don't have any milk in the fridge. And then other women often say, wow, I'm really glad you said that. Because for me, often the conversation is the complete opposite. I'll go, oh, I've been given a load of bottles of lubes. Does anybody want some lube? And I had somebody who was like, I don't need lube, thanks. I'm juicy enough. I don't need lube. And I'm like, well, lube has all sorts of useful, you can use it in all different kinds of ways. Is your ass lubricated? And they're like, no, but I don't need it. And so I find sometimes for me, it's about how in those female only spaces you have the conversations, because sometimes for me, I actually leave feeling worse than I do when I've gone.
Well, and this is why the crowd is so important, right? And for us, we created this sacred first philosophy, which is sort of like our shared agreements, right? Like, this is what we think when we come into these spaces. We also start the space in ritual. And, a lot of times it's dancing with a somatic healer or a drummer or something. We also, you know, center a lot of different women. And, we're a very diverse crew. And so, asking for authenticity and curiosity is the culture that we try to build in all of our events. And, I always say it's the power of the pack. Right. Like, if you have a lot of folks that just want to love up on, everybody and, then that's what people are going to do. Right. Like, and, you know, I knew we were onto something when we had this moment in one of our first brunches that we were doing. And it was this young Black woman and, just beautiful poet, right? Just all the amazing things. And we had a panel, and the panel was diverse, right? And then we had a small group discussion. And one of my friends who was white was in her group. And she said that, this woman started by, they were talking about, the feelings of the conversation and things like that. And she said, I started with an eye roll because there was a white woman on the panel and I didn't know what white women could teach me about my liberation and wellness. And she was like, but I actually enjoyed her the best. My like takeaway is that we can learn all women can learn from each other. When you set up that kind of energy, it kind of becomes hard, but it is really unfortunate. And I think you see this in a lot of wellness practices. I see it a lot in spiritual practices where ego can join your quest. And all of a sudden, this self-righteousness feels so right.
Totally. I mean, unfortunately,
Not that I know anything about that.
oh no, there's a lot of myths about women's sexuality, especially for women in their 50s and 60s. What are some of those myths that you really do want to challenge?
There is no need to stop. And I love how we're embracing perimenopause, menopause, and maybe because, I had no interest in children, like this idea of, a barren womb or, my last little egg leaving me, like, didn't really, hasn't really created a lot of stress. I'm actually like, can it just leave so I could like, I'm like, this is my last IUD, right? Like that's how I'm looking at the world right now, but for so long, it was this narrative that like we were supposed to be miserable. We were, like, oh my God. And like, yes, hot flashes suck, rage flashes suck, right? Like there's a lot about it that sucks. But there's also a lot about it that's really freeing, but we don't get to say those narratives, right? Like this idea of not being able to be pregnant, like, or this idea of like having travel money or, whatever it is as women get older, that's what we need to be leaning into. And having the confidence to explore your body, and unfortunately, I want to recognize that not all women are there, right? Like, I've met women in their 60s who have never looked at their vagina in a mirror. And like, that was one of the things they did after, one of our gatherings, right? But ladies, we've made it this far. Fuck it. You know what I mean? Look at your vagina, play with your vagina, love your vagina. I mean, I always say, like, I could recognize my vagina in a lineup. Are you kidding me? Like, her and I roll. So the older we get, the more fun we should be having, especially for folks who have children and children are grown, like, embrace your life. So I think the myth that I want to stop is that somehow we can't continue to be sexually active and explorative. You want to try kink in your 60s and your 70s. Like, why not?
Yeah. I meet a lot of people now who are only just starting to get into that because, they're coming out of long marriages and a lot of them are just sexless marriages. And they're thinking, well, if it's not now, when is it going to be? And so, they're doing all of that. But I think it's really interesting also exploring the fact of being an older child free woman, because that is probably the ultimate taboo, is it not? A sexual older woman who's not going to be a granny. I mean, people find even just the idea of the fact that you get to a certain age and they just assume that there's a grandma label that just gets attached before your name, because that's sort of how so many people identify older women, right? And so to be a woman, I think, without children and to be sexual, I think that is pretty much out there in the world.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's very interesting to navigate the world, as a single, child free, sexually active woman, right? Like, I go to Martha's Vineyard every summer and I joke around saying sometimes I just want to like rent a husband so that wives will stop giving me dirty looks. It's like, sis, I don't want your husband. I'm just here for the canapes, just like you. If I want anything from your husband, it's probably an investment or a donation or for him to sit on a board seat. Yeah, it's also then what people assume, and I think for me, like, I mean, like I said, I knew I didn't want to have kids, but then I got to a point in my 40s where I'm doing a lot of emotional labor so that I could move forward in getting to know someone or something like that. And I didn't know if it was worth it, So I sort of took a step back and was like, how much am I investing versus what I'm actually looking for? And I think it led me to this like really wonderful place of not worrying about it and also being very open to receive it.
Yeah, I have a friend who's just turned 50 and single, no kids. And we had a conversation the other day about exactly this, about the fact that she's been dating people and doing a lot of the carrying of emotional labor. And she's just so tired of it. She's a working woman. She's very dynamic, got loads of friends. And I think there's a lot of women of our age that are coming to this realization that relationships don't need to make you exhausted.
Exactly. If they're making you exhausted, they're not the right relationships, Because folks ask me all the time, like, oh, well, are you on the apps? It's like I'm supposed to be actively pursuing, right? And it's like, well, why? Not that you cut yourself off, but you decenter it. And, I think for a lot of women, especially those of us lucky enough to be born in a time of women can get credit and get jobs and all this kind of stuff. Yet we haven't decentered this idea of I'm not worthy if I haven't been chosen. We're leading the way, our generation, Suzanne, for the younger folks. They're just going to do the Golden Girls. Like they're just going to plan for that.
It's really interesting though, because you know what? I either speak to women who are still out there kind of looking for that romantic partner, right? Really desperate for that romantic partner. And I have people that come in and out of my life that I mainly have intimate relationships with and not much else because the emotional labor is too exhausting and I'm just not that keen on it anymore. But I find that not a lot of us are having these conversations about like, what does a later life relationship look like or not look like? Like, how can we decenter men from our lives when we've been brought up to believe that they are central to our lives? And even yesterday, I had a conversation with a woman who was like, well, there's a legitimate reason for marriage, which is for legal reasons, like for having medical and pension, like there are legitimate reasons in some countries why marriage actually makes good financial sense. Not that it makes sense in any other way, but especially for women, it doesn't always work out so well for them. But I think it's a really interesting conversation about the fact that at this stage of life, if you've still got your health and you're financially secure, which is, let's face it, it's a privilege to have both of those things, then we can make that decision. Like these people do not have to become the center of our existence. And we can look at sexuality in a different way than perhaps we did when we were younger. That sort of plays into one of my questions about social conditioning. How does that block pleasure later in life? And how can women begin to unlearn those lessons?
As we talked about, the social conditioning starts when you're being told that you're asleep and then a man kisses you and you wake up and then you marry that man, right? When my niece was like one, she had some verbal, but not much. And, we were reading through a Beauty and the Beast or some princess novel. And the prince was like swirling the princess around. And she was like, Dada, right? Because that's who swirls her around. She's one. When I tell you, I threw the book across the room. I was like, Sarah, this is when it starts. I'm like, from now on, I'm reading her philosophy. She's not going to understand it, but she'll pick up the vibe. It was wild, so that social conditioning. And then also, what does it mean to give it up when there's so few models of what giving it up looks like?
Well, that's the big question I always have. Like, what's the alternative? That's the problem, right? It's like people don't see the alternative.
Right. And I think we're seeing it more and more, like I always shout out Tracy Ellis Ross with her solo travel, like she's doing so much to like show what it can look like. And it was unfortunate, at least in the US, with the Trump election and, this childless cat lady thing. But I think there's also other parts of society that are embracing the realities of the situation, which are women are choosing differently, and I think how you live, how I live really becomes the model. In so many ways, we are the first generations of women who can do this in a quote unquote free world. So we're figuring it out for the other folks. And I think the more we can heal ourselves, stand in our own power, the better role models we will be.
I think you're right that we are the first generation that's actually been able to do this. And I'm sure you find the same thing as I do, that people sort of go, God, you're so brave. You're so brave, right? Like, it's not really about bravery. It's just about making different choices. It's just about looking at the alternatives and going, you know what? I tried all of that and it wasn't really great for me. So let's try something else.
That part, like, I'm just really dedicated to feeling good. And not just physically, like emotionally, right? I go to therapy, I have a spiritual practice. I work to undo the generational and current traumas that sit in my body and mind. So I can't see it doing it any other way. And there's this idea that grinning and bearing it, you made your bed, you have to lie in it. And I think for me, I just couldn't do that. Like, I just couldn't grin and bear it. Or what is it? Close your eyes, think of England. Like, I just couldn't do those things. And so when I talk about somehow, people are like, oh my God, we need this space. They'll be like, and of course you're the one to do it. I think if there is a thread in my career and life that brought me to this. It really is like I've spent my life building a career speaking truth to power. And that's what we're doing now for women in the bedroom.
The more of us that can do that, the better it is for women. I don't think that we're going to move the needle from 69% to 99%, but even if we move it to 80%, I'd be good with that.
Exactly. We'd be able to reimagine another world. And, this is something I think it's also important that I want to highlight is for me as an organizer, I see this business as a movement. When we're not using our magic to survive in fake orgasms, like imagine what we can use our magic to do. Another world is possible if women can stand in their purpose, power, pleasure.
Exactly. And just stop faking it, gals. Because the thing about faking it is it doesn't help men to become better lovers. And it doesn't help women to get the kind of sex that they want. It just doesn't help anybody.
That's it.
And the more you do it, the more you validate men's inadequacy in the bedroom, right? The more you say it's okay to be shit in bed instead of just saying, do you know what? When you did that, it felt really good. If you'd only just moved your hand just a little bit to the left, it would have felt even better.
Yes. And, I also want to highlight here that if you don't know what you like, it's always best start with yourself. Masturbation is your best friend. Do it all the time. Use props, right? Like you can use porn, you can use, like, there's so many things, but that helps you realize what you like. And then I find this even in our conversations with men is that most men would like to please their partner. Right? Most people would like to please their partner. There are some folks who don't give a shit and just, hey, if you didn't get it done in that amount of time, that's on you. But like most people don't. And I think, if you are a chart kind of girl, maybe, that's who you are. But like you said, you can say it or you can just move their hand, right? Like you can just push their head down. They'll understand what you're saying. And so I think have fun with it. I just actually did an article for Scary Mommy blog around talk as kink. And, this idea of calling folks like, oh, you're a good girl, things like that, and you can also bring in what to do in talk while you're having sex and make it hot and be like, do all the things.
I completely agree. Communication is key. It runs through every episode of Sex Advice for Seniors I've ever had. And if you can nail that one down, then chances are you're going to get what you want.
That's it. And start with yourself, right? Start with communicating with yourself. Ooh, I like this. I like that. Try different things.
Yeah, for sure. So we've come to the end of Sex Advice for Seniors now. If you could leave our listeners with one message about worthiness, pleasure, and aging, what would it be?
First, thank you so much. This has been so much fun. But I think the message that I want to leave with folks is like, you have it all already. Give yourself grace, give yourself space, and allow for you to sit in your own magic because you deserve it. And for no other reason, I also want to let your listeners know that if you want to come on our site, we have a code for your listeners so that they can get a discount. And I actually have a guide called Stop Faking It, your guide to purpose, power, pleasure. So you can download that. That's free. We're just handing that out because, that's ultimately what we want to help women do. Live more authentic, more liberated lives. So don't beat yourself up if you're not living it. You don't live it every day. We're not going to be Buddha. But what we can do is give ourselves grace and space to enjoy our lives.
I think that is a great way to end the show. Thank you so much, Malia, for coming on Sex Advice for Seniors, and have a lovely, lovely day.
Thank you. You too.
Just a quick nudge. If you haven't visited sexadviceforseniors.com yet, what are you waiting for? It's the place where curiosity, experience, and a little mischief all meet. After this episode, pop over to sexadviceforseniors.com and I can guarantee a good laugh or two.